For 9 years, Silas Mercer rejected the most beautiful women in the frontier region. Wealthy widows, noble ladies, women who could bring men to their knees with a smile. They came in silk dresses and sweet words. He chased them all away. But one stormy night, on a dark mountain road, a girl in dirty clothes, calloused hands, penniless, was the only one who stopped beside his broken cart. No promises, no expectation of reward. Just a knife, a piece of oak, and working hands. That was the moment that changed everything. If you want to know what made the richest and most stubborn man in the frontier region finally choose a girl despised by the entire valley, watch until the end. Like to support the channel and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon, the kind that rolled in off the high ridgeline without warning and turned familiar mountain roads into something unrecognizable. By the time Silas Mercer's wagon hit the bad stretch of trail 3 miles above Caldwell Hollow, the sky had gone the color of a bad bruise, and the wind was loud enough to make the horses nervous. He felt the crack before he heard it, a deep, wrong shudder through the floorboards, the kind that traveled up through your boots and into your spine and told you something had given way that shouldn't have. Then the left rear corner dropped, the wagon lurching hard to that side, and Silas grabbed the bench rail with both hands to keep from pitching out into the dark. He pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down into the mud. The rear left spoke had sheared clean off, not just cracked, but gone. The wood split at the hub with the force of something hitting a rock hidden under the rushing water that now crossed the trail in a sheet. The wheel wasn't going to hold weight. He could see that from where he was standing, rain already working its way down the back of his collar. Silas stood there a moment, water dripping off the brim of his hat, and looked up and down the road. Nothing. Just the dark shapes of pine trees bending in the wind and the sound of water moving fast somewhere off to his left. He was 52 years old and had been running the Mercer Ranch alone for 9 of those years. He knew this mountain. He knew every shortcut and every bad crossing and every place where the trail turned treacherous in wet weather. He also knew that standing here waiting for someone to come along was not a strategy, because nobody with sense was going to be on this road tonight. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. The Mercer Ranch sat on 430 acres of bottomland and timber in the Harrow Valley, the best watered property in 3 counties. Silas had built most of it himself in the years before his wife Margaret died. The main house, the horse barn, the equipment sheds, the long fence lines that ran straight and true across the lower pastures. Margaret had died of fever 11 years ago, and for the first 2 years after, Silas had simply worked. He worked the way other men drank, steadily, without pleasure, because stopping was worse than going. Then the women started coming. Not right away. There was a period of respectful distance that the community observed, a year or so where people left him alone. But once that was done, once it became clear that Silas Mercer was healthy and solvent and running one of the most valuable properties in the valley, the widows appeared. It wasn't cruel of them, exactly. Life on the frontier was hard on women, and a prosperous ranch with a living man attached to it was a practical solution to a lot of problems. Silas understood that. He didn't hold it against any of them. He just said no. The first one was Harriet Colburn, who had a pleasant face and a well-kept farm of her own, and who came to the point so directly that Silas had almost respected it. "You need a woman who can run a household," she said, sitting across from him at his own kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her. "I've run one for 20 years. I'm proposing we be practical about this." "I appreciate you coming all the way out here," Silas had said. "But no." She'd blinked at him. "Just no?" "Just no." After Harriet came Clara Finch, who was younger and more inclined toward charm, and who brought a pie. Silas thanked her for the pie and told her the same thing. Then came Dora Whitfield, and after her the Pearson widow, whose first name he could never get straight, and then a woman from over near Sutter's Fork, whose name he'd already forgotten. All of them were respectable. Several were genuinely handsome. 2 or 3 of them were clearly smarter than he was, which he acknowledged privately. He said no to every one of them, always politely, never with an explanation that satisfied anyone, including himself. His ranch hand Abe had asked him once, flat out, what he was waiting for. "Don't know," Silas had said. "You're not getting younger." "I know that too. Ranch this size needs more than one person running it." "I'm aware." Abe had given him a look that said he thought his employer was either a fool or a man with a very specific idea in his head that he hadn't figured out how to name yet. Silas suspected Abe was right, but he couldn't do anything about it. He just kept saying no, and the valley kept watching, and the years kept passing. He had been standing next to the crippled wagon for maybe 20 minutes, long enough for his coat to be soaked through at the shoulders, when he heard the mule coming. It was a single animal, moving slow, with the unhurried quality of something that had been walking in the rain long enough to stop caring about it. A lantern swayed somewhere ahead of it, throwing a small circle of yellow light on the trail. When the mule came close enough, Silas could see there was a cart behind it, a flatbed, loaded with what looked like equipment. Tools, maybe. Something covered with a piece of oilcloth that had mostly stopped being waterproof. The person driving was young. He could see that much before he could see anything else. Young and slight. Wearing a man's canvas coat that was several sizes too big, the collar pulled up against the rain. They had the reins in both hands and were looking at his wagon, at the dropped corner in the ruined wheel, with an expression that was hard to read in the bad light. The mule stopped on its own. The young woman, and he could see now that it was a woman, though the coat and the hat and the general state of her made it easy to miss, didn't say anything right away. She just set the brake on her cart and climbed down and walked around to look at the wheel, crouching down next to it with the lantern held close. "Spoke's gone," she said, not to him, more like thinking out loud. "I know," Silas said. She looked up. She had a narrow face with a straight nose and dark eyes that caught the lantern light in a way that made her look older than she probably was. There was a smear of something, grease maybe, or soot, across her left cheekbone, and her hands, when she reached out to touch the hub, were rough and dark at the knuckles. Working hands. The hands of someone who'd been doing heavy work since they were young enough that the work had left its mark on the bones. "You got anything to work with?" she asked. "I've got some rope and a hand axe in the back." She stood up and looked around at the trees on the uphill side of the road. Her gaze moved the way a person's does when they're not looking at scenery but calculating something. Then she walked off the trail and into the trees without asking his permission or explaining herself. Silas stood next to his wagon and listened to the rain and the wind and the sound of someone moving through underbrush in the dark. A few minutes passed. Then he heard an axe, a sound he recognized, short and efficient, not someone chopping wood, but someone cutting out a specific section of something with a plan already in their head. She came back with a piece of fresh oak, straight-grained, about the right dimensions. "You have a draw knife?" she asked. "No." She went to her cart and came back with one. Then she sat down on the wet ground next to his wheel, in the mud, without any ceremony about it, and began to work. Her name was Elena Voss. He found that out later, not that night. That night she didn't offer her name, and he didn't ask, partly because watching her work had put him in a state of mind that wasn't well suited to conversation. She shaped the spoke with a focus that shut everything else out. Rain, dark, the cold, the discomfort of sitting in mud, none of it appeared to reach her. She worked the draw knife in long strokes that curled thin ribbons of pale wood off the oak blank, stopping every few passes to sight down the length of it, checking for straight. Her hands were steady. She didn't rush. "You needed a little proud of the shoulder here," she said at one point, mostly to herself. "Hub's worn." Silas was holding the lantern so she could see. "You done this before." "My father's a wheelwright." She didn't look up. "Was. He's not much anymore." A pause. "He hurt his back 3 years ago, and the work fell to me." "You've been running his shop?" "I've been keeping it alive." There was a difference in how she said it that Silas noticed, though he didn't comment. She worked for another 40 minutes. He offered once to take a turn, and she handed him the draw knife without objection, then took it back after 2 passes because he was going at the wrong angle, and she didn't have time to be polite about it. He wasn't offended. She was right. When she fitted the spoke into the hub, it seated clean. She tapped it home with the back of the axe, a careful series of blows that were measured and not one of them wasted, then rocked the wheel by hand to check it, leaned down and looked at the seat from the inside. "That'll hold to the valley floor," she said. "Don't push it on the downgrade." She stood up and wiped her hands on her coat, which did nothing for her hands but was apparently a habit. Silas looked at the wheel, then at her. She was already walking back to her cart, pulling herself up onto the bench without any fuss, picking up the reins. "What do I owe you?" he said. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite dismissal. Something more complicated than either. "Nothing," she said. "Get out of the rain." She clucked to the mule and the cart moved off down the trail, the lantern swaying, and in 30 seconds the dark had swallowed her up like she'd never been there. Silas stood next to his repaired wagon in the rain for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he climbed up and drove home. He found out who she was the next morning, which took some asking around because nobody seemed to think Elena Voss was worth knowing much about. Gus Henley at the feed store knew her father, Carl Voss, who had run a small wheelwrights operation near the eastern edge of the valley, close to the timber road. "Old Carl hurt himself bad a while back," Gus said. "Spine, I think. He's not right anymore. Does a little work, but nothing serious." He paused. "Girl's been keeping the place going. Don't know how." "Does good work," Silas said. Gus looked at him like he wasn't sure why that was relevant. "I suppose. She's not much to look at." Silas didn't say anything to that. He bought his feed and drove back to the ranch and spent the morning working on fencing, which was physical enough to keep his hands busy and not so complex that it required his full attention. He thought about the way she'd found the right tree in the dark, the way she'd sighted down the blank to check for straight, the way she'd known without being told that the hub was worn and the spoke needed to compensate for it. He'd been around skilled people most of his life. He knew what it looked like when someone was competent versus when they were truly good at something. There was a quality to the best of it that was hard to explain, a kind of economy, an absence of wasted motion, a sureness that came from knowing what you were doing so well that it didn't require thinking anymore. Margaret had had it with horses. Abe had it with cattle. His own father had had it with timber. Elena Voss had it with wood and iron. He drove out to the Voss place 3 days later. It was not much of a place. The workshop was a low building set back from the road with a lean-to forge attached to the side, the kind of setup that had been built piece by piece as need arose rather than planned from the start. The yard around it was dense with salvaged iron, wheel rims and axle housings and hardware in various states of rust, organized with a logic that wasn't immediately visible, but that he suspected was there if you knew where to look. Carl Voss was sitting in a chair outside the workshop door, a blanket over his legs despite the mild weather, watching Silas come up the road with the expression of a man who'd been around long enough to recognize trouble of various kinds. He was maybe 60, with a gray beard and eyes that had been sharp once and were still trying to be. "Mercer," he said. It wasn't a greeting exactly, more an identification. "Voss." Silas climbed down from his wagon. "Your daughter fixed a wheel for me the other night, up on the Harrow Trail in the storm." Carl looked at him. "She mentioned that. I came to pay for the work." "She said you offered. She said she told you no." "She did?" The old man looked at him steadily. "Then I guess the business end of that is settled." A pause. "You drove all the way out here to pay for something she already told you was free?" Silas took off his hat. "I also came to see if she needed work." The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind where the person you're talking to is recalibrating something. Carl Voss looked at the workshop, then back at Silas. "She's inside," he said. Elena was at the anvil when he came through the door, and she didn't stop working right away. She was straightening an iron rod, a task that required a specific rhythm. Heat it, strike, check, reheat. And she finished the sequence before she turned around. She was not, as Gus Henley had noted, much to look at in any conventional sense. She was on the shorter side, solidly built, with none of the soft presentation that the women who'd visited his ranch over the years had offered. Her hair was pulled back severely, there were smudges on her face from the forge work, and her clothing was practical to the point of bluntness. She looked at him with the same dark, assessing eyes he remembered from the rain. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not unfriendly. Not particularly warm, either. "You do work for hire?" he asked. She set down her hammer. "Depends on the work. I've got a wagon axle that's been giving me trouble for 2 seasons. I've had two men look at it and neither of them fixed it right. I've also got a hay baler that needs the feed mechanism rebuilt." He paused. "And I suspect there's more once I know whether you can do those." She studied him. "Why'd you come to me?" "Because I watched you work. For 40 minutes in the rain. That was enough." Something shifted in her expression, not much, and she didn't let it stay. She turned back to the bench and set the iron rod she'd been working on into the rack with the others. "Axle first," she said. "Bring the wagon Thursday." She came on Thursday and fixed the axle in 4 hours. She came the following week for the baler, which took 2 days and required her to fabricate 2 parts from scratch because the originals had been wrong to begin with. Silas watched her work when he could, which wasn't always because the ranch had its own demands. But he noticed things. She didn't ask for help she didn't need. She didn't offer opinions on matters that weren't her business. She ate lunch by herself near the equipment shed, a piece of bread and some salt meat, eating quickly and without ceremony. The ranch hands gave her a wide berth, not out of hostility so much as simple uncertainty. She didn't fit into any category they knew how to deal with, so they mostly left her alone, which seemed to suit her. What she was, Silas decided, was self-contained. Not cold, not unfriendly, just a person who had learned, probably early, that the world wasn't going to make space for her, and had consequently stopped waiting for it to. At the end of the second day, when the baler was done and running clean for the first time in 2 years, Silas paid her what they'd agreed and then said, "I've got more work, if you want it. Regular basis." She looked at him. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning I need someone who can keep the equipment running, not hired by the job, on a regular contract." "I've got my father's shop." "I know. I'm not asking you to give it up. I'm asking if you can do both." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through it. Not the money, or not only the money, but whatever the arrangement would mean and cost and require. "Fair wage?" she said finally. "Better than fair?" Another pause. She looked out at the pastures, which were going golden in the late afternoon, the grass still thick from the spring rains. "All right," she said. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Silas found hard to describe, even in his own head. Elena came to the ranch 3 days a week and worked through whatever needed working through, and the ranch's machinery, which had been in various states of complaint for years, slowly became reliable in a way it hadn't been since Margaret's time. A pump that had been losing pressure, a fence post auger with a bent drive shaft, the hay wagon with the off-true bed that made loading difficult. She dealt with all of it methodically and without drama, and the ranch ran better for it. They talked during this time, but not the way he talked to his hands or to the other ranchers he dealt with in the course of business. Elena asked questions when she needed information and answered them the same way. She didn't fill silence for the sake of it. She had opinions, but she didn't volunteer them unless she thought they were useful. One afternoon, she was working on a water wheel fitting for the mill shed, and he was nearby mending harness, and she said, without preamble, "You ever think about taking on more cattle?" "Sometimes," he said. "North pasture's underused. Water's not reliable up there." She was quiet for a moment. "The old irrigation ditch that runs off the East Fork. You ever think about clearing it out? It ran all the way to the North pasture 20 years ago, before it silted up." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "There's a survey map in the county office. I looked at it once when I was figuring out where the Sutter property drains." She shrugged. "It would take some work, but it's not complicated. The gradient's right." Silas thought about this. "You looked at a survey map of my property?" "I look at survey maps." A pause. "I like knowing how water moves." He went back to the harness. After a minute, he said, "I'll think about the ditch." She went back to the water wheel fitting. The afternoon moved on in quiet, and it occurred to Silas that this was, without question, the most comfortable he'd felt in someone else's company in a very long time. He wasn't sure what to do with that observation, so he set it aside for the moment and finished the harness. The proposal happened in October, which nobody expected, least of all Silas himself. The Valley's social calendar had produced, as it did most falls, a gathering at the Brennan place, a dinner and dance that served as the community's way of marking the end of harvest season and acknowledging that they'd all made it through another year. Silas went because not going required more explanation than going, and because Abe's wife had made a point of telling him he needed to be there. The widows were there. They were always there. Clara Finch in a blue dress that someone had spent considerable time on. Harriet Colburn with her practical bearing and her sharp eyes. 2 or 3 others he recognized from previous campaigns. They were pleasant enough. He danced with Clara because it would have been awkward not to, and he talked ranch business with Harriet for a while because she was knowledgeable and the conversation was useful regardless of its other implications. The evening moved the way these evenings always did, and Silas was considering a polite departure when he saw Elena. She was not there as a guest exactly. She'd been hired, he gathered, to repair the Brennan cider press, which had chosen this particular week to develop a problem with its drive mechanism, and she'd apparently stayed past her working hours because the repair had run long. She was standing near the back of the room with a glass of water, still in her work clothes, watching the dancing with an expression that had no particular feeling in it one way or the other. Just watching. He went over. She looked at him when he got close. "Mr. Mercer." "Elena." He stood next to her and watched the dancing for a moment. "Get the press working?" "Close enough. I need a part I don't have. I'll come back Monday." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. The fiddles were playing something he didn't know the name of. "You want to dance?" She looked at him with an expression that suggested she was checking whether he was serious. When she determined that he was, she looked back at the dancers. "I don't really dance," she said. "Neither do I, if I'm honest about it." A small silence. "Then why'd you ask?" "Because I wanted to," he said, which was the truth and wasn't a complete answer, and they both knew it. She looked at him again, longer this time. Something in her face was working through something that she wasn't going to say out loud. "All right," she said. They danced badly and without apology, and the people around them noticed, and Silas didn't care. And Elena appeared not to either. Quote, he drove her home afterward because her mule had been put in the Brennan stable and the night was cold. They rode without much talk, which had become their normal mode, but there was something different in the quiet this time, a kind of weight to it, like the air before weather. At the turnoff to the Voss place, he stopped the wagon. "Elena," he said. She was looking at the road ahead. "I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" "You've been thinking about it for a while. I could tell." She was quiet a moment. "I'm not what anyone expects. I'm not looking for what anyone expects. I'm not gentle. I don't know how to—" She stopped. "I'm not easy to live with. I know that about myself. I'm not easy to live with either. I've been alone 9 years. I've got bad habits." She looked at him then, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen before. Not the assessment she usually brought to things, but something more unguarded than that. Something that looked briefly like fear of a very specific kind. The kind that came from wanting something and not trusting that it would stay. "You could have any of those women in there," she said. "I know that." "Why wouldn't you?" He thought about the rain on the mountain trail, the way she'd found the right tree in the dark, the spoke seated clean in the worn hub, the way she'd known, without being told, exactly what was needed. "Because I watched you work," he said. "And I've never once seen you do anything halfway." The silence stretched out for a moment. Then she said, "You'd have to be patient with me." "I think I can manage that." Another silence. The horses shifted in the traces. Somewhere off in the dark, something moved in the brush and was gone. "Ask me properly," she said. He did. She said yes, and it wasn't soft or romantic exactly. She said it like a person who'd made a decision and meant it, which was better than soft and better than romantic, and Silas knew it. Carl Voss took the news quietly when Silas came to speak to him the next morning. He sat with it for a long time, looking at his hands where they rested on the arms of his chair. "You know what you're doing?" he said finally. "I think so," Silas said. "She's not—" The old man stopped, started again. "She's not easy. She never was, even as a girl." He was quiet. Her mother left when she was 8, thought the frontier was too hard. Maybe she was right about that. I don't know. He looked out at the workshop. Elena stayed, took the work on, didn't complain about it, or not much. He paused. "I never told her enough what that was worth." I'll tell her, Silas said. Carl looked at him. Whatever he saw in Silas's face appeared to settle something. All right, the old man said. What? The wedding was simple. A brief ceremony at the county seat, 2 witnesses pulled from the street because neither of them had people who were prepared for this on short notice, and then a drive back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the light going gold over the pastures and Elena sitting beside him on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap. She'd worn a dress. He'd noticed that without comment because commenting on it seemed like it might embarrass her, and he didn't want to start like that. It was a plain dress, gray-blue, and she wore it the way she wore everything, with her full attention on the thing at hand rather than on herself. You nervous? He said, about halfway home. She considered the question seriously. A little, she said. You? Yes. She looked at him. Good, she said, and there might have been something close to a smile in it. I'd have been worried if you weren't. The wagon rolled on down the valley road, and ahead of them the Mercer Ranch sat in the late light exactly as it always had. The main house, the barn, the fence lines running straight across the bottomland. But it looked different to Silas than it had in a long time. Less like a thing he was maintaining and more like a thing he was coming home to. That distinction had been missing for 9 years. He hadn't known how much he'd felt the absence of it until it came back, riding beside him in a gray-blue dress with grease still faintly visible at the base of her thumbnail, where she hadn't quite scrubbed it all off. He didn't mention the grease. He drove them home. The news reached the valley the way most news did out here, not through any single announcement, but through the slow, unstoppable movement of information from one person to the next, picking up detail and distortion as it went. By the second morning after Silas and Elena's return from the county seat, most of Harrow Valley knew that Silas Mercer had gotten married. By the third morning, they knew who he'd married. And by the end of that week, there wasn't a household within 20 miles that hadn't weighed in on the subject. The reactions sorted themselves out roughly by category. The men who ran cattle and knew Silas professionally were mostly confused, then dismissive. A man could do what he wanted with his own life, and they had enough of their own problems without worrying about his. A few of them made comments about it at the feed store or the mill, jokes about wheel spokes and wheelwrights that they thought were funnier than they were. And then they moved on to things that mattered more to them. The women were less willing to move on. Claire Finch heard it from her neighbor, who'd heard it from the postmaster's wife, and she sat with it for a long time at her kitchen table before she allowed herself to feel what she actually felt, which was a kind of anger she didn't have a clean way to express, because expressing it would require admitting exactly how much she'd been counting on a different outcome. She was 38 years old, and she'd spent the better part of 2 years being patient and presentable and available. And Silas Mercer had walked past all of it to marry a girl who fixed wagons for a living and couldn't be bothered to keep the soot off her face at a social gathering. Harriet Colburn took it differently. Harriet was practical above all things, and she recognized, once the initial surprise settled, that she wasn't actually heartbroken. She was offended. There was a difference. She had made Silas Mercer a reasonable offer, and he had declined it, and that was his right. But to decline her, and Clara, and the others, and then choose that, it felt like a judgment, like he was saying something about all of them through the choice he'd made. She said as much to Clara when Clara came to visit, sitting in Harriet's front room with cups of tea going cold between them. "He's saying we weren't what he was looking for," Clara said. Her voice was careful. "That's what it means." "What he was looking for," Harriet repeated in a tone that communicated exactly what she thought about that. "He was looking for a woman who smells like a forge and doesn't own a decent dress." She had a dress at the Brennan party. She was working at the Brennan party. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know what to do with this, Harriet." Harriet looked at her. "I do," she said. Elena knew they were talking about her. She wasn't naive about that. She'd grown up in this valley, on the outside edge of it, and she understood how the social machinery worked, who talked to whom, what information moved and how fast, which slights were forgiven, and which ones got stored up like wood against a hard winter. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how it would feel to be inside the Mercer house when all of that was happening outside it. The house was large by frontier standards, a proper structure with real floors and glass in the windows, and a kitchen that had more space than the entire Voss workshop. Margaret Mercer had left her mark on it in ways that were still visible 9 years later. A particular pattern of hooks by the back door, a kitchen garden that had gone partly wild but still came in every spring, a way the furniture was arranged that suggested someone who'd thought carefully about how a household should function. Elena moved through these spaces carefully at first, the way you move through someone else's territory, not sure where her weight was welcome. Silas was not a demonstrative man. She'd known that before she married him. He didn't fill rooms with himself or require attention or create the kind of noise that some men use to establish their presence. He was quiet, and he kept to his routines, and he was, as far as she could tell, genuinely trying to make room for her in a life that had been organized around one person for 9 years. That trying was visible in small ways. He cleared a section of the equipment shed for her tools without being asked. He told the hands she had authority over any machinery on the property. He moved things in the kitchen to make the workspace more practical without commenting on the previous arrangement. He was not always easy. He had opinions about how things should be done that were sometimes wrong and always stated as though they were settled fact, and the first time Elena pushed back on one of them, it was about the feed schedule for the horses, which he was getting wrong in a specific way. There was a moment of friction that felt, briefly, like it might be something worse. But he'd listened, and then he'd said, "All right," and adjusted, and they'd moved on, and the moment passed. They were still figuring out the shape of what they were to each other. That was honest. It was also, Elena suspected, how it was supposed to be. What was less honest and more complicated was the world outside the house. Whoa. The first real incident happened at Holt's Dry Goods 2 weeks after the wedding. Elena had driven into town for supplies, a routine errand, the kind she'd made dozens of times before, and she was working through the list she'd written out that morning when she became aware that the 2 women at the counter had stopped their own conversation and were watching her. She recognized them. Dora Whitfield and a woman named Patrice Sello, whose husband ran the sawmill. Not enemies exactly, just women who had, until recently, occupied a different social stratum from Elena Voss, and who were now confronted with the uncomfortable fact that Elena Voss had, through some alchemy they couldn't quite account for, ended up above them. "Mrs. Mercer," Dora said. She put just enough emphasis on it to make it mean something other than a simple address. "Dora," Elena said, "we were just saying how surprised everyone's been." Dora's tone was pleasant and light, the kind of pleasant that required effort to maintain. "It was so sudden." "Most things are," Elena said. She handed her list to the clerk and waited. Silas always seemed like a man who'd take his time with that kind of decision. A pause. "But I suppose, at a certain age, a man gets impatient." The clerk was pretending to read the list very carefully. Elena looked at Dora directly. She had found, over the years, that looking at people directly when they were being unkind had a useful effect. It made them aware that she understood exactly what they were doing, which took some of the enjoyment out of it. "You need anything else?" the clerk said, a little too quickly. "Just what's on the list," Elena said. She collected her supplies and carried them to the wagon herself. She didn't hurry. She loaded each box with the same methodical care she brought to everything, tied them down so they wouldn't shift on the road, checked the harness. She did all of this while Dora and Patrice watched from the window, and she did not once look back. On the road home she was fine. She was also furious, which she understood was reasonable, and which she had no particular outlet for, which was frustrating. She didn't tell Silas. There wasn't a version of telling him that helped anything. Masen. The second incident was harder to absorb. Someone left a dead chicken on the front porch of the ranch house. This was not the kind of thing that happened by accident. It was placed there, arranged in a way that made the arrangement deliberate, and Elena found it in the morning when she came out to start the day. She stood on the porch and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked it up by the feet and put it in the scrap bucket and scrubbed the porch boards and went to work. She told Silas that evening. He was quiet for longer than she expected. He'd come in from the north pasture, and he was still standing in the kitchen, not having sat down yet. And when she told him about the chicken, he went very still in a particular way that she was beginning to recognize. The stillness of a man who was angry and was deciding what to do with it. "Any idea who?" he said. "No, guesses." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she paused. "I'm angry." "So am I." "I know." She turned back to the stove where supper was working its way toward ready. There's not much to do about it right now except let them know it doesn't work. How do we let them know that? By not moving, she said. He was quiet a moment. That's it? We just stay put and take it? We stay put and work and don't give them anything to feed on. She looked over her shoulder at him. The people doing this want a reaction. If we react, they know it got to us. If we don't, she turned back to the stove. They'll get bored, or they'll go too far and it'll land back on them. Either way. Silas pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. That's a hard way to live. I've lived harder, she said. It wasn't complaint, just information. He ate supper without saying much more. But she noticed after that he started leaving the lamp burning in the front window at night when he came in late, so the porch was lit. A practical measure that required no discussion and solved a problem without making it larger. That was, she was learning, how he loved, in practical measures. The sabotage moved from symbolic to concrete a month into the marriage. Someone, and there were by this point a short list of candidates, got into the equipment shed. They hadn't taken anything, which would have been one kind of trouble. Instead, they had loosened the coupling on the main water pump just enough that it looked fine until you put it under load, at which point it would fail, and fail messily. If Silas's hands had run that pump through a long irrigation cycle without noticing, and they might have because it wasn't the kind of thing you checked, it would have cost them a week of work and possibly the pump itself. Elena noticed it because she noticed things like that. She'd come to the shed for a different reason entirely, and stopped when she saw the coupling, crouched down and looked at it, turned it by hand, and felt the wrong give in it. She fixed it. Then she went through the rest of the equipment slowly and methodically, checking every connection and joint and fitting, looking for other interference. She found 2 more, nothing catastrophic, but deliberate. Someone had been in here who knew enough about machinery to know what would cause problems and what would look accidental. That narrowed the list. She was still in the shed when Silas came to find her, an hour later than she'd said she'd be, and she showed him what she'd found. He crouched next to the coupling and looked at it. His jaw was tight. Harriet Colburn's brother-in-law, she said. He ran the Sutter machinery before they sold. He knows this kind of equipment. You sure? No, but he's the only person on my list who would know where to put the interference and where to leave it alone. She looked at Silas. Someone told him what to look for, though. Someone who knows your operation. Silas was quiet. You trust your hands? She said. Most of them. A pause. There's a new man, Denny Grath. He came on in September. He stopped. He was Clara Finch's hired man before. Elena nodded slowly. This wasn't proof. It was a shape in the dark that might be the thing you were looking for, or might be something else entirely. Don't fire him yet, she said. Why not? Because then they know we figured it out, and they'll try something else that we're not ready for. She stood up. I want to know what they're actually planning before we show our hand. Silas looked at her. You think this is organized. I think someone who was angry on their own would have broken something. She gestured at the equipment. This takes patience. This takes someone who's thinking ahead. She paused. I think there's more than one person behind it. He was silent for a moment, working through it. Then he said, What do you want to do? Keep my eyes open, she said, and make sure everything on this property is running exactly right. Every piece of equipment, every fence, every structure. I want there to be nothing broken on this ranch that someone could point to and say we're not managing it. She looked at him steadily. They want to prove you made a mistake. The only answer to that is to make sure everything works. It was more words than she usually said at once. She could feel herself settling back into the quieter mode she usually operated in. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he said, All right. And then, Elena. She looked at him. I didn't make a mistake, he said. It was simple and direct and without ornament, and it landed in her chest like something solid. She didn't say anything back, partly because she didn't have the right words ready, and partly because she thought, in this case, that silence was an adequate answer. She went back to checking the equipment. He went back to the pastures. The ranch went on around them, and outside its fence lines, something patient and unpleasant was still making its plans. But inside those lines, things worked. Elena made sure of that. Every morning she made sure of that, and it was the best defense she knew how to build, and she was going to build it right. The name came to Silas through Abe, the way most useful information reached him. Quietly, without fanfare, delivered in the tone of a man who wished he had better news. Consolidated Range Syndicate, Abe said. They were standing at the fence line on the eastern edge of the property, mending a section that had come loose in the last windstorm. Out of Callaway, they've been buying up land from here to the ridge for the past 18 months. Silas kept working. Who told you? Reed Paulson, over at the Anchor Creek place. They approached him last spring, offered him twice what the land was worth. Abe paused. He took it. Reed took it. Silas stopped and looked at him. Reed Paulson had been on that land for 11 years. Said the offer was too good to walk away from. Abe was quiet a moment, pulling wire taut. There's been 4 others since. Whitmore, the Sutter parcel. That was already sold, but the syndicate bought it from the new owners 3 months in, and the 2 small operations up near the timber road. Silas did the math in his head. The parcels Abe named formed a rough shape around the southern and eastern edges of the Mercer land, not surrounding it, but getting there. They come to me yet? Silas said. Not formally. Abe tied off the wire. But I heard from the harness maker in town that a man named Pratt was asking questions about the Mercer water rights, how they're recorded, whether there's any overlap with the old Sutter drainage easement. Silas knew the easement Abe meant. It was a 40-year-old document that predated the formal county survey, the kind of legal gray area that a clever lawyer could make trouble with if he had the patience and the backing. Pratt work for the syndicate? I think Pratt is the syndicate, Abe said. Least, he's the face of it out here. That evening, Silas told Elena what Abe had said. He'd gotten into the habit of telling her things directly, without editing them first, because she had a quality of absorbing information without flinching that made it easier to be straight with her. He laid it out. The land purchases, the water rights inquiry, the shape of what seemed to be forming around them. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, The easement on the old Sutter drainage. Do you have a copy of the original document? Somewhere. Find it, she said. Tonight, if you can. They found it in the box of land records Silas kept in the back room, a folded, brittle piece of paper that took careful handling. Elena read it slowly, then read it again. Her face didn't change much, but something in her went still in a particular way. The language is loose, she said. Loose how? It references the drainage channel by its original name, which no one uses anymore. And it doesn't specify the terminus point clearly. She set the document down on the kitchen table. A lawyer who knew what he was looking for could argue this gives access rights across the northeast corner of your property. That's where the main well feeds from. Silas sat down. They could claim rights to the water. They could try to. It wouldn't hold up necessarily, but it would be expensive to fight. And while it was being fought, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They stop the water. They stop the ranch, Silas said. They slow it enough. Same result. Elena looked at him. We need someone who knows property law in this county, not a generalist. Someone who knows the survey records and the water code specifically. There's a lawyer in Caldwell. Not Caldwell. Too close to whoever the syndicate has there. She paused. I know someone in Merritt. My father used him once for a dispute over a property line. He's old, but he's sharp, and he doesn't owe favors to the big operations. You want to go to Merritt. I want to go to Merritt before they make their next move, she said, which I don't think is far off. She was right about that. The next move came before they could get to Merritt. It started with the supply road. The Mercer Ranch's main access to the valley floor ran through a half-mile stretch of road that crossed what had always been considered common land, a corridor used by several operations, never formally owned by anyone, maintained by whoever needed it most. 3 days after Silas and Elena's conversation about the easement, a crew arrived and began fencing that corridor. Not syndicate men directly, a contracted outfit from out of the county, who said they had authorization from a property claim that had apparently been filed 6 weeks ago and granted without public notice. Silas rode out to confront them and was shown paperwork that looked legitimate enough that he couldn't dismiss it on the spot. He rode back to the ranch and found Elena already in the equipment shed, which meant Abe had gotten to her before him. "Abe told me," she said when Silas walked in. She was looking at the wall where she'd started sketching the ranch layout in chalk. Property lines, water sources, access routes. "They've been planning this for months. That claim wasn't filed in response to anything we did. It was already in motion. If that road closes, we can't get supply wagons in," Silas said. "Or out. Not by the main route. There's the north track that goes around through the timber, but it adds 4 hours and it's rough on loaded wagons." She studied the chalk drawing. "We need to get word to the other ranchers who've been using that corridor, Brennan and the Hoyle operation. If they're cut off too, we have standing together that we don't have alone. Brennan won't stick his neck out. He's been nervous since the Whitmore sale." "Maybe, but he loses access too. That tends to focus a man's mind." She turned away from the wall. "I'll ride to Brennan tomorrow. You go to Hoyle." Silas looked at the chalk drawing. "And Merritt?" "After. One thing at a time." He nodded. Then he said, "The hands need to know what's happening. Some of them are already nervous." "I know," she said, and then with a flatness that told him she'd already been thinking about it. "Denny Grath packed his tools this morning. He's gone." Silas hadn't known. He felt the implication of it land in his chest. Not just the confirmation of what they'd suspected, but what it meant. Someone had told Grath the situation was turning, and Grath had decided to be somewhere else before it got worse. "Who else might go?" he said. Elena was quiet a moment. "Pete Aldrin's been quiet all week. I don't know about him." She paused. "The others I think will stay. Martinez and the 2 Colby brothers. They've been here long enough to have real loyalty to the place. And old Webb. He's not going anywhere." "What about you?" Silas said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it was there, and once it was, he didn't take it back. She looked at him. "What about me?" "This is worse than either of us planned for," he said. "I'm not saying go. I'm asking." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he had time to regret asking. Then she said, "I fixed your spoke in the rain on the side of a mountain for no reason except it needed doing. What does that tell you about whether I'd leave now?" He didn't have a good answer for that. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back, and went back to the chalk drawing. Brennan wouldn't commit. He was sorry, he said, genuinely sorry, but he had children and a note on the bank, and he couldn't afford to put himself on the wrong side of people who had the legal reach the syndicate seemed to have. He shook Silas's hand twice and apologized twice more, and ultimately said nothing. Hoyle was different. Luther Hoyle was 64 years old and had built his operation from nothing and had a quality about him that reminded Silas of certain horses, past the age of being broken, too set in their own nature to accommodate anyone else's. He listened to Silas's account without expression, then said, "They closed the road on me too, 3 days ago. I was waiting to see who'd come to me." "We're putting together a case," Silas said. "Elena found a lawyer in Merritt." "What does the lawyer think?" "We haven't gotten there yet. The road happened first." Hoyle nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at his own land. "I had an offer from Pratt in August," he said. "I told him no. He was pleasant about it. Too pleasant." He looked at Silas. A man who expects to get what he wants is always pleasant when you tell him no because he's already figured out the alternative. "We can fight this," Silas said. "Maybe." A pause. "I'll back you on the road claim. Can't do much more than that right now. My son's got a bad leg from the harvest accident, and I'm short 2 hands." He looked at Silas steadily. "But I'll put my name on whatever you file." It was less than Silas had hoped for, and more than he'd expected from the day. He went home. The water troughs were poisoned on a Thursday. It was crude relative to the other moves the syndicate had made. A direct, unsubtle act that felt like frustration showing through. Someone had gotten to the north and east troughs during the night and put something in them, something chemical that turned the water a color that was wrong enough to see in the morning light before any animal drank from it. Silas's hands caught it early. Nobody lost any stock, but it was close, and it was a message of a different kind than the fencing or the legal maneuvering. This was more direct. This was someone saying, "We're not only going to beat you in a courtroom." Elena was at the troughs when Silas got there. She had a kerchief over her nose and was crouching next to the east trough, looking at the water without touching it. "Copper sulfate," she said when he crouched next to her. "Too much of it. You can smell it if you know what you're smelling." She stood up. "It won't have gotten into the main well. The troughs feed separately from a holding tank, but we need to drain them both and clean them before they go back into service." "That's a day's work," Silas said. "More like 2. She looked at him. "Martinez and I can do it. You need to go to Merritt today." "You were supposed to come with me." "I know, but someone needs to stay and this can't wait." She looked at the trough, then at the pastures beyond it, where the cattle were beginning to drift toward their morning water. "Take Abe. He's steady and he knows the roads." Silas looked at her. She was managing the situation, not trying to manage him, but making actual decisions about what needed doing and who should do it and in what order, the way she managed everything. He had noticed over the months since the wedding that there was a particular quality to watching Elena deal with a problem. She didn't get bigger with it, didn't inflate herself or become louder. She got more still and more precise, and somehow that was more reassuring than the alternative would have been. "I'll be back tomorrow evening," he said. "I know." She paused. "Silas?" He'd already started toward the barn. He stopped. "Whatever the lawyer says," she said, "bring back a copy of the current survey plat if you can get it. The one filed in the last 5 years. I want to compare it to the old one." "What are you expecting to find?" "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing. But the syndicate knew about that easement language before we did, which means someone read those records recently. I want to know what else they read while they were there." He looked at her for a moment. "You think they found something else?" "I think they're not doing all of this just for water rights to one corner of one property," she said. "I think there's something in the land records that makes this specific ranch worth the trouble." The lawyer in Merritt was named Aldous Crane, and he was old enough that his hands shook slightly when he handled paper, but his eyes were sharp behind his spectacles, and he asked good questions in the right order. He looked at the easement document, asked for the survey plat, studied them both for 20 minutes while Silas and Abe sat across from him and waited, and then said, "The road closure is vulnerable. The claim that was filed relied on a survey description that doesn't match the current plat. Not by much, but enough." He set the papers down. "The water rights argument is more complicated. The easement language is legitimately ambiguous." "Can we fight it?" Silas said. "You can. It'll take time and money." Crane looked at him over his spectacles. "What concerns me more is the pattern. 4 parcels purchased in sequence, legal pressure on the holdouts, supply interference." He paused. "I've seen this approach before, in the eastern counties, 5 or 6 years ago. The syndicate, or something like it. Different name, same structure. They weren't after any individual parcel. They were building a corridor." "For what?" "Rail spur," Crane said. "There's a proposed route that the Territorial Railroad Commission has been sitting on for 3 years. If it gets approved, the land between Callaway and the Harrow Ridge becomes extremely valuable overnight." He looked at Silas steadily. "Your property sits at the center of that corridor." Silas sat with that for a moment. "They want the land for the railroad. They want to buy it cheap before the rail route is announced and sell it to the railroad at 10 times the price." Crane picked up the easement document again. "The water rights claim isn't really about water. It's about pressure. Make the operation difficult enough, and the offer they put on the table starts to look like relief." Abe, who had been quiet through all of this, said, "What do we do?" Crane folded his hands on the desk. "File an immediate challenge to the road closure. I can have that drafted by morning. The survey discrepancy gives us solid ground." He paused. "For the rest of it, you need evidence of the rail corridor connection. If we can show the court that the syndicate's legal actions are coordinated with inside knowledge of an unannounced rail route, it changes the nature of the case considerably. That's not obstruction of one man's land, that's fraud." "How do we get that evidence?" Silas said. "That," Crane said, "I'm not entirely sure. But you should start with whoever is carrying information between the syndicate and the Territorial Commission's office. He looked at Silas. Someone is. These things don't work without a connection on the inside. Silas rode back to the ranch the following evening with the challenged road filing in his saddlebag and Crane's words still running through his head. The corridor, the rail spur, the ranch at the center of something that had been planned out long before the dead chicken on the porch, long before Denny Grath, long before Harriet Colburn and her collected grievances. He came in through the north track, which was rough and added an hour to the ride, because the south road was still blocked and he hadn't expected the challenge to resolve that fast. He found Elena in the workshop she'd set up in the corner of the equipment shed, lit by 3 lanterns, doing something with a piece of machinery he didn't immediately recognize. She looked up when he came in, read something in his face, and set down her tools. He told her everything. Crane's analysis, the railroad corridor, the fraud angle. She listened the same way she always listened, completely, without interruption, without visible reaction until he was done. Then she said, "That's why they wanted the survey records." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lantern nearest her. "The rail route. If it goes through the valley the way you'd expect, along the bottomland, it runs within a quarter-mile of the restored irrigation ditch." "What does that matter?" "Because whoever owns the water access controls the land adjacent." She looked at him. "Silas, if we get that ditch running before the route is announced, we establish a water use claim on land the syndicate is counting on having access to," he said slowly, "and it puts us in a completely different legal position." She paused. "It's not a solution, but it's another angle, another piece of ground they'd have to fight us on." He looked at her. "How long to clear the ditch?" "With the right crew, 3 weeks, maybe 4. A pause. "Webb knows that ditch. He worked on it 20 years ago, and Martinez has done irrigation work." "And the machinery?" She almost smiled, which for Elena was the equivalent of a broad grin on anyone else. "I've been taking apart 2 of the old hay wagons. The chassis are sound. I've got an idea for a water diversion frame that can be moved by 2 people. She glanced at what she'd been working on when he came in. "That's what this is." Silas looked at the piece of machinery on her work table. He didn't know what it was yet. He was fairly sure that in 3 weeks he would. "What else do you need?" he said. "Workers," she said. "People who know the property and aren't afraid of getting wet." She looked at him steadily. "Not the ones who are going to leave when it gets worse. The ones who'll stay." "It's going to get worse," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Outside the equipment shed, the night was quiet in the way that the frontier was sometimes quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but patient. The kind of quiet that preceded something. Silas Mercer had been on this land long enough to know the difference, and he stood in the lantern light of his own equipment shed and looked at his wife and understood, clearly and without comfort, that what was coming was going to require everything they had. He just hadn't known, until recently, how much that turned out to be. The ditch work started on a Monday with 6 people and a mule, which was not enough, and everyone knew it. Webb walked the full length of the old channel first thing that morning, moving slow because his hip was bad, but reading the ground with the confidence of someone who'd done it before. And when he came back, he said it was worse than he remembered in the middle section, but better than he'd feared at the upper end, and that the main silting problem was a 40-foot stretch where a fallen oak had redirected runoff for probably 15 years and built up a dam of compressed sediment that was going to be genuinely hard work to shift. Elena listened to all of this and then asked him 3 specific questions about the gradient in the lower section, which Webb answered with the patience of a man who appreciated being asked the right things. And then she went back to the diversion frame she'd been building in the equipment shed and modified it based on what he'd said. The frame was, when finished, a thing that looked like it had been assembled by someone working from instinct rather than any formal plan, which was accurate, but that functioned with a logic that became clear once you saw it in use. It was mounted on the reclaimed chassis of the old hay wagon, low to the ground, with a curved iron blade at the front that could be angled to direct water flow sideways while a team moved forward through the channel. It wasn't elegant. The welds were visible and some of the joints were heavier than they needed to be because she'd been working with available material rather than ideal material. But it moved the work along at roughly twice the rate of manual digging, and on the third day, when Martinez figured out a modification to the blade angle that improved the cut on hard-packed sediment, it got better still. Silas worked the ditch alongside the others. This was not something Elena had asked him to do. He had simply showed up on the first morning with a shovel, and no one had commented on it, and it had become part of how the days went. He was not young, and the work was hard, and by the end of each day, his back let him know about it in ways it hadn't when he was 30. He didn't mention this. The work needed doing. What he noticed, working alongside his wife, was that she talked more out here than she did almost anywhere else. Not constantly, and not about anything personal, but she explained her thinking as she went, why she was directing water a certain way, why the gradient mattered in a particular spot, what the soil composition told her about where the old channel walls had been. It wasn't for anyone's benefit specifically. It was more like she thought out loud when she was working, and working out here with real problems and physical resistance brought it out of her. He found he could listen to it for a long time without minding. Pete Aldrin left on the 9th day of the ditch work, which Silas had half expected and which still felt like a small blow when it happened. Pete was a decent hand and had been on the property 3 years, long enough that his departure meant something beyond the loss of a worker. He came to Silas in the morning before the day started and said he'd had an offer from the Hoyle operation and that he thought it was time for a change. And the way he said it told Silas everything about who'd made the offer and why. "All right," Silas said. "I'll have your wages ready by noon." Pete looked like he'd expected more argument or more anger. Getting neither seemed to make him more uncomfortable. He left without saying anything else. Silas told Elena that evening. She was cleaning the frame's blade with a wire brush, her hands already dark from the day's work. "The syndicate's trying to thin us out," she said. It wasn't a question. "Looks that way." "How many do we actually need to finish the ditch?" 4. Maybe 5. "We have 5. She kept working. "We finish in a week if nothing else goes wrong." "Nothing else going wrong seems optimistic." She glanced at him. "I didn't say I expected it. I said, that's the condition under which we finish in a week." He almost smiled. She went back to the blade. The letter from Pratt arrived on a Wednesday, delivered formally through the county sheriff's office by a deputy who seemed embarrassed about his own errand. It was a legal notice asserting the syndicate's claim under the disputed easement and demanding that the Mercer Ranch cease all water diversion activity pending resolution of the water rights question. It was written in the kind of language that was designed to sound more definitive than it was, and attached to it was a counterfiling to Crane's road challenge that was dense and technical and clearly written by someone who knew what they were doing. Elena read it at the kitchen table that evening. She read it twice, which was her habit with documents she was taking seriously. Then she set it down and looked at Silas. "They know about the ditch," she said. "How?" "Someone told them, or they've had someone watching." She paused. "It doesn't matter which. They know we're close to finishing, and they're trying to stop us legally before we can establish use." She tapped the letter. "This cease notice? It has no enforcement mechanism yet. It's a warning, not an order. We're not legally obligated to stop today. But if we keep going and they get an injunction, we stop. But getting an injunction takes time and requires a judge to agree there's sufficient cause, and Crane challenged their water claim already." She looked at him steadily. "We have maybe 4 days before they can get in front of a judge. We need 5 days to finish. That's not enough room." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to write to Crane tonight. I need him to file a counter to this notice tomorrow if he can, and I need him to argue that cessation of work would itself cause irreparable harm to established water access, which is true, because if we stop now, the channel walls we've already opened will start collapsing again in the wet weather." She looked at the letter. "Buy us 2 more days with the legal back and forth, and we have a chance." She wrote the letter to Crane that night by lamplight, sitting at the kitchen table long after Silas had gone to bed. And if the writing went slow in some places, it was because she was choosing words with the care of someone who understood that the words were doing load-bearing work. 4 days later, the syndicate stopped waiting for the courts. It came at night, which wasn't a surprise. The kind of people who did this kind of thing had learned that darkness was practical, that it provided cover and reduced witnesses and made everything harder to prove afterward. What Silas and Elena hadn't fully anticipated was the scale of it. There were 8 men. They came in on the south side of the property, through the gap where the road closure had created dead ground that nobody was watching as carefully as they should have been. They had torches and they had axes, and their plan appeared to be simple: fire the stables, destroy the ditch equipment, and make the point that legal maneuvering was a slow game that the syndicate wasn't interested in playing anymore. What they didn't know, and what had been true for 6 days without anyone making a fuss about it, was that Elena had reopened the old irrigation tunnel. It wasn't on any current map. It was a hand-dug passage that ran from the base of the main well, housing under the equipment yard, and came out near the old mill foundation at the north end of the property, originally built by the man who'd owned the land before Silas's time as a way to manage overflow during spring floods. Elena had found reference to it in the old survey map she'd been studying, and she'd spent 2 evenings locating it and another afternoon clearing the entrance. And she told almost no one because there hadn't seemed to be a reason to tell anyone. She told Webb and Martinez on the afternoon of the 4th day, when something in the quality of the preceding days, the silence from Pratt, the abrupt withdrawal of the legal counterfiling that Crane had flagged as unusual, told her that the ground was shifting under them in a way that didn't feel like courtroom maneuvering anymore. If something happens at night, she told them, and we need water fast, we don't go for the pumps. We go for the tunnel entrance, and we open the floodgate manually. The main channel we've built this week runs directly above the tunnel exit point. If we open the gate, the water pressure from the well feeds into the channel, and we can direct it anywhere on the north and east quadrants of the property. Martinez had looked at her. You built the ditch to line up with the tunnel exit. I surveyed where the tunnel came out first, she said. Then I built the ditch. Webb had been quiet through this, looking at the ground the way he looked at everything, like he was reading it. You knew this was coming, he said. I knew something was coming, she said. I didn't know what. She woke to the smell of smoke, not the gradual drift of it that came from a fireplace or a burn pile, but the sharp, fast smell of something catching that shouldn't, and she was already sitting up before she was fully awake, her hand on Silas's arm. Fire, she said. He was up and moving. She was 2 steps behind him, pulling on her boots, and when they came out the back door, the stables were already burning. Not fully, not yet, but the east wall was lit, and the horses were screaming, and 2 of the hands were running toward it from the bunkhouse, and someone was shouting something she couldn't quite make out. She saw the men, 3 of them near the stables, and through the smoke she could see more shapes moving toward the equipment shed where the ditch frame was stored. Get the horses out, she said to Silas. She said it clearly, once, and he went without arguing. She ran for the equipment shed. One of the men saw her coming and moved to intercept her, and she didn't slow down. She went around him, not through him, using the corner of the shed wall as a pivot, and he grabbed at her coat and got a handful of empty canvas as she pulled free. She got through the shed door and wedged it from the inside with the iron bar she'd installed for exactly this reason 2 days ago, which bought her maybe 2 minutes. She went straight for the floor panel she'd cut in the back corner of the shed, the access point to the tunnel entrance. She pulled it open, dropped in, landed on packed earth 3 feet down, and moved. The tunnel was tight and low and smelled of old water and clay, and moving through it fast in the dark required committing to it in a way that didn't allow for hesitation. She knew the length of it because she'd walked it 3 times, and she counted her steps, and when she reached the floodgate, she found it by feel in the dark, a heavy iron wheel valve that was stiff from disuse and that she had to put her whole weight behind before it began to turn. It moved, slowly, then faster, as the seal broke, and she heard the water before she felt it, a low rush that built quickly as the pressure came through. She turned the valve until it was fully open, then turned around and moved back through the tunnel at a crouch, counting steps, pulling herself back up through the floor panel into the shed. Someone was hitting the shed door with something heavy. She picked up the nearest tool with real weight to it, a timber maul, and went to the door and pulled the iron bar free and stepped back in the same motion, and the door came open and the man on the other side wasn't ready for that and stumbled forward, and she stepped out of his way and let him go past her into the shed. She came out into the night. The channel was running. She could see it in the firelight, the water moving fast along the diversion they'd built, the flow stronger than she'd expected because the pressure had built up in the sealed tunnel and was releasing all at once. Martinez was at the diversion gate, which he'd gotten to without being told, and he was directing the flow toward the stable wall with the length of trough pipe they'd fitted at the channel's terminus. Webb was somewhere in the dark behind her. She could hear him shouting, and she could hear the Colby brothers, both of them, she registered with something like relief, responding. The stable wall that was burning was soaked down in under a minute. Not all of it, not the roof, but the wall that the fire needed to climb. The horses were out. She could hear them, smell them, feel the specific anxiety of animals that had been frightened recently and were still running that fear through their systems. She looked for Silas. She found him under the partial collapse of the stable's east overhang, which had come down when the roof beam gave way. Not a full structural failure, just the lean-to section over the side door, but enough. He was on the ground, the beam across his legs, not unconscious but not able to move, his face tight with something she read as pain rather than panic, which was useful. "Silas, I'm all right." His voice was even. "Beam's not on my spine. I can feel my feet." "Can you pull?" "I can try." She got her hands under the beam. It was heavy, heavier than she was, and the angle was wrong, and the ground under her feet was wet now from the channel water and uneven from the debris. She got her shoulder under it, which hurt, and pushed up while he pulled himself back with his arms, and the beam moved 2 inches, and then another 2, and he got one leg clear, and then the other, and she let the beam down and straightened up, and her shoulder informed her clearly that it was going to be problematic in the morning. He was upright, limping, and his left arm had a long cut on it from something she hadn't seen happen, but he was standing. She looked around the property. The syndicate men were gone. Not all of them had run at the first appearance of the water. 2 of them she could see at the far edge of the property, being detained by Martinez and one of the Colby brothers in a way that had the specific quality of physical certainty. Men who had understood that the situation had reversed itself and were no longer in a position to argue about it. The stable was damaged, but standing. The ditch frame was intact. The water was still running along the channel, doing now the peaceful work of filling the north trough that it had been built to do all along. Silas stood next to her and looked at his ranch. His left arm was bleeding in a slow, steady way that meant it needed attention, and he was leaning slightly to the right to take weight off the leg the beam had been on, and none of this appeared to register on his face as anything worth commenting on. "The tunnel," he said. "Yes." "You built the ditch above the tunnel exit." "Yes." He was quiet a moment. "When did you figure out you might need to do that?" "When I read Crane's first letter," she said. He described the syndicate's pattern. "I thought about what the end game would look like if the legal approach failed." She looked at the stable. "I hoped I was wrong." He looked at her. The firelight was going down now as the last of the flames came under control, and in the dimmer light he looked tired and old and genuine in the way people did when they'd been stripped of everything performative. "Elena," he said. "Your arm needs wrapping," she said. "In a minute." He kept looking at her. "I need you to know something." She waited. "I've had people work this ranch for 20 years, he said. "Good people. People who knew cattle and horses and land." He paused. "I never had anyone who could do what you just did." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know." And it wasn't vanity, see. It was just acknowledgement of something true, and she said it the way she said everything, without ornamentation, without apology. He almost laughed. It was a rough sound, more like a caught breath, but it was there. "Come inside," she said. "I'll look at that arm." They walked back to the house, and behind them the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a night that had been tested and had held. Not perfectly, not without cost, but had held. In the distance, toward the valley road, Silas could see a lamp moving. Then 2. Then more. Neighbors coming to see what the smoke had meant. They were late, as neighbors often were, but they were coming, and that too, he thought, was something. The neighbors who came that night with their lamps were mostly useless in the practical sense. The fire was already down. The syndicate men who hadn't run were already restrained, and there was nothing left to do that required an audience. But they came, and they stood in the yard of the Mercer Ranch in the small hours of the morning with their coats pulled against the cold, and they looked at what had happened and at what was still standing, and that looking meant something even if nobody said it directly. Luther Hoyle was among them. He came in his wagon with two of his hands, and he walked the perimeter of the damaged stable without speaking, reading the night's events and the physical evidence the way an experienced man read terrain. When he got back to where Silas was standing, his arm wrapped in linen that Elena had done tightly and without ceremony, Hoyle looked at him and said, "How bad?" "Stable wall in the overhang. Everything else held." Hoyle looked at the channel, still running slow in the dark. He looked at the two syndicate men sitting on the ground near the equipment shed with Martinez standing over them. He looked at the ditch frame, intact. "Your wife did the channel?" he said. "She did." Hoyle was quiet for a moment. "I watched her work on my gate mechanism last fall," he said. "When she came to fix the one you sent her for, I watched her for 10 minutes before she noticed me standing there." He paused. "I thought at the time that I'd never seen anyone that age work like that." Silas didn't say anything. "I didn't say that to anyone," Hoyle said. "I should have." He looked back at the stable. "I'll send 2 men in the morning to help with the repair." It was not an apology exactly, because Hoyle was not built for apologies, but it was the closest thing to one available from a man like that, and Silas accepted it as what it was. The two restrained men were handed to the county sheriff at first light. They gave their names as hired labor from out of the county, which was true as far as it went, and they said they'd been paid in cash by a man they knew as Briggs, which was the name Aldous Crane had already associated with the syndicate's field operations. It wasn't enough to close the case, but it was a thread. Crane pulled that thread for 6 weeks. He was methodical about it and not dramatic, which was his nature, and he filed documents and requested depositions and corresponded with the Territorial Commission's office in a way that was persistent without being the kind of aggressive that caused people to dig in. What he found, piece by piece, was the connection Elena had suspected from the beginning: a land agent named Corville, who held a position with the Territorial Railroad Commission and who had been providing the syndicate with advance information about the rail route survey in exchange for a stake in the land purchases. It was not a clean discovery. Nothing about the legal process was clean. There were weeks where it seemed like the whole thing was going to come apart, where Pratt's lawyers filed counter-motions that were dense enough that Crane had to spend 3 days just parsing them before he could respond, where the road closure was reinstated temporarily by a judge who hadn't read the survey comparison carefully enough, where Silas came home 2 evenings in a row looking like a man who was calculating how long he could keep this up. Elena kept working. She finished the irrigation ditch. She rebuilt the stable wall with Webb and Martinez in 11 days, working mornings before the legal matters required Silas's attention and evenings after. She rerouted a section of the channel that had developed a slow leak in the 3rd week, which required pulling up 50 feet of previously laid work and redoing it, and she did this without complaint but also without pretending she wasn't frustrated about it, because she was, and pretending otherwise would have been a waste of energy. She wrote 3 letters to Crane herself, without telling Silas until after she'd sent them. He found out the second time and said, carefully, that he thought they should coordinate their communication with the lawyer. "You were going to wait 2 days to send that information," she said. "I didn't see why we should wait." "Because Crane needs to know what's coming from our side so he's not caught flat-footed." I told him what was coming. Silas looked at her. "Elena, it would help if we talked about these things first." She was quiet for a moment. He was right, and she knew he was right, and admitting it was not natural for her in the way it seemed to be natural for some people. She'd spent too many years making decisions alone, answering to no one because there had been no one available to answer to. "I'll tell you first," she said. "Next time." "Thank you," he said. And then, because he understood her well enough by now to know that this had cost her something. The letter was good. Crane said so. She looked at him. "He said that?" "He said your instinct about the commission filing window was correct, and it gave him 2 days he wouldn't have had otherwise." She went back to what she'd been doing. But something in her shoulders had settled slightly, and Silas saw it, and he filed it away in the growing catalog of things he was learning about his wife. That she did not need approval exactly, but that competence recognized was not the same as competence ignored, and the difference mattered to her even when she would never say so. Corville broke in the 7th week. He didn't break dramatically. He didn't confess in a courtroom or make a public statement. He broke the way men in his position usually broke, which was quietly and in private, under the specific pressure of understanding that the alternative was worse. Crane had built enough of a case by then that the Territorial Commission was conducting its own internal inquiry, and Corville had reached the point where cooperating produced a better outcome than not cooperating, and so he cooperated. What he provided was a written account of the arrangement between himself and the syndicate, names, dates, the structure of the land purchase scheme, and most critically the documentation that showed the syndicate had acted on advance knowledge of a public process that hadn't yet been made public. That was the fraud. That was what changed the character of everything that had come before, from aggressive business practice to something the courts had to treat differently. Pratt left the territory. Silas heard this from Crane in a letter that was short and factual, which was how Crane communicated good news as well as bad. Pratt and two of the syndicate's principals had apparently decided that relocation was preferable to the legal exposure that was building, and they had gone south, taking with them the legal pressure that had been on the Mercer Ranch for the better part of a year. The road closure was overturned. The water rights claim was dismissed. The properties that the syndicate had accumulated through the corridor scheme were placed in receivership pending the fraud investigation, which meant they would eventually come to market at fair price rather than being held for railroad speculation. It was not a clean victory in the way stories like to present victory. Silas's stable was still rebuilt, and the rebuild was visible if you knew where to look. The months of legal fees had cost real money that they would be feeling for a couple of years. Pete Aldrin didn't come back, and there was no reason to expect he would. The relationship with Brennan, who had declined to help when help was needed, would never quite be what it might have been if he'd made a different choice when it mattered. But the ranch was standing, the water ran, the land was his. Except Carl Voss came to stay in the spring, which was Elena's doing. Her father's hip had gotten bad enough over the winter that living alone at the workshop was no longer practical, and she'd told Silas about it in the direct way she told him things. Not asking exactly, but making the situation clear and letting him respond to it. He'd said, "Bring him here," without hesitating, and she'd looked at him in a way she didn't look at him very often, a way that was quieter than her usual assessment, something that went in a different direction. Carl arrived on a Tuesday with his tools, which he insisted on bringing even though it wasn't clear he'd be using them much, and he settled into the room at the back of the house that got the morning light, and he and Silas developed over the following weeks a slow and careful acquaintance that was not exactly friendship, but was something solid of its own kind. They played cards in the evening sometimes and argued about timber, and Carl told stories about the valley as it had been 30 years earlier, before the big operations had come in and rationalized everything. And Silas listened in the way that a man listened when he understood he was receiving something that wouldn't be available much longer. One morning, Elena came in from the equipment shed and found the two of them at the kitchen table with a piece of wheel hardware between them that Carl was examining with his hands because his eyes weren't reliable at close distance anymore. And Silas was explaining what he thought was wrong with it, and Carl was explaining patiently why Silas was wrong, and neither of them looked up when she came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched them. Something in her chest moved in a way she didn't entirely have language for. She'd spent most of her adult life managing the shop, managing her father's decline, managing the judgment of people who thought her rough hands and practical clothing were a summary of her worth. She'd managed alone because that was what the situation required, and she'd been good at it, and it had cost her in ways she hadn't always let herself acknowledge. This was different. This was not management. This was... She stood in the doorway and looked at her father's hands on the wheel hardware and her husband's face as he listened to being corrected, and understood that what she was looking at was something she had not dared want for a long time. She went to start breakfast, and the argument about the wheel hardware continued without her, and that was fine. Harriet Colburn came to the ranch in late April. Elena saw her coming up the drive and felt the specific quality of dread that came from a situation she couldn't fix with tools. She considered staying in the equipment shed and letting Silas handle it, which was not something she was proud of considering, and then she set down her work and walked out to meet Harriet on the front porch because hiding from things was not how she was built. Harriet looked the same as she always had, practical, composed, the kind of woman who entered situations having already decided how they were going to go. She looked at Elena, and Elena looked at her. and there was a moment of mutual taking stock that was uncomfortable for both of them and honest in its discomfort. "I came to say something," Harriet said. "All right," Elena said. "I wasn't kind to you after Silas chose you." Harriet paused. She was not a woman who found this kind of thing easy, and the difficulty was visible, and Elena found she respected her more for not hiding it. "I was angry, and I let other people carry that anger further than I would have on my own. The chicken—" She stopped. "That wasn't something I did, but I knew who did it, and I didn't stop it, and that's near enough." Elena was quiet. "I'm not asking you to forgive it," Harriet said. "I'm telling you I know it happened, and I know my part in it." She paused. "What you did with this ranch, what you did in the fall, people are talking about it differently now than they were a year ago. I think you already know that." She looked at Elena steadily. "I think they were wrong before, and I was wrong with them, and I wanted to say so to your face." Elena looked at her for a long moment. She was aware of the many things she could say to this, and she sorted through them in the space of a breath and settled on the one that was true. "I know you're not a bad person," Elena said. "I knew that even then." A pause. "I just needed you to not be an obstacle." Harriet blinked. Then, to Elena's mild surprise, she made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That's fair," she said. "They didn't become friends. That would have been too neat. And life on the frontier was not neat, and both of them were too old for that kind of ending to feel true." But Harriet left with the things said that she'd come to say, and Elena went back to her work, and the specific weight of that particular unresolved thing was lighter than it had been before. The rail route was announced publicly in June. It ran, as Crane had predicted, through the bottomland corridor of the valley, and the land values along that route moved sharply upward in the weeks that followed. The Mercer Ranch, sitting at the center of that corridor with clear water rights and a rebuilt irrigation system and a legal record that had been thoroughly established through 6 months of court filings, was worth considerably more than it had been a year ago. Silas did not sell. He did, however, have 3 conversations with the railroad's land agent about right-of-way for the spur line, and he negotiated those conversations in a way that Crane said later was some of the most effective property negotiating he'd seen in 30 years of practice. Silas was not modest about where the negotiating approach had come from. "Elena told me what to ask for," he said. "She knew railroad right-of-way law. She read about it for 2 weeks before the meeting." He paused. "She reads about things she needs to know. That's what she does." Crane looked at him over his spectacles. "You're a lucky man, Silas." "I know," Silas said. "I knew it from the first night." Yes. There was an evening in August that Silas thought about later, not because anything particular happened during it, but because of the quality it had. The specific, unrepeatable quality of a moment that you recognize, while it's still occurring, as something you'll want to have held on to. He was on the porch. The day's work was done, and the light was going down behind the ridge in the west, and the valley was doing the thing it did on good evenings, going gold, and then amber, and then something without a clean name, and Elena was sitting on the step below him with a piece of iron hardware she'd been puzzling over for 2 days, turning it in her hands, not working on it, but thinking about it. They'd been quiet for a while. The comfortable kind. "Do you ever think about the night on the mountain?" Silas said. She turned the hardware over. "Sometimes." "What do you think about?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think about how I almost didn't stop." She didn't look at him. "I was tired that night. I had a long day and the rain was bad, and I knew if I stopped to help someone, I'd be another 2 hours getting home." She paused. "I almost kept going." He hadn't known that. "What made you stop?" "The wheel," she said. "I could see from 20 yards that it was a spoke problem, and I knew I had the right wood in the cart." She turned the hardware over again. "It would have bothered me. Knowing I had what it needed and going past anyway." Silas looked out at the valley. "I think about what I would have done if you hadn't stopped," he said. "What would have happened to all of this? You would have figured something out. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been what it is." He paused. "I spent 9 years saying no to people I should have said yes to, and yes to things I should have walked away from. I had a ranch, and I had land, and I had a reputation, and none of it—" He stopped. None of it was enough by itself. I don't think I knew that until you. Elena set the hardware down on the step beside her. She looked out at the pastures where the cattle were settling into the evening. The irrigation channel caught the last light and held it for a moment, a thin line of silver running across the near pasture and on toward the north, doing its quiet work the way water always did. Not dramatically, not with any awareness of what it meant, just moving toward where it was needed. People kept telling me I wasn't what they expected, she said. What they expected from a woman. What they expected from a wife. A pause. I spent a lot of years being angry about that. You're not angry now? She considered it. Sometimes, she said, but it's less than it was. She was quiet a moment. I think I was angry because I thought it was something I needed to fix. What other people thought of me. I thought if I just worked hard enough or proved enough. She stopped. It doesn't fix. People think what they think. You can't work your way into someone else's respect. Harriet came around, he said. Harriet came around because she's a decent person who made a mistake and had enough character to say so. Elena looked at her hands. That's about Harriet, not about me. The things I did because they needed doing. Not for her, and not for anyone else who was watching. She paused. That took me a while to understand. That you can do good work your whole life, and it won't make everyone approve of you, and that's not the failure you think it is when you're young. Silas was quiet for a moment. The evening moved on around them, unhurried and indifferent to whatever they were working out on this porch. I should have found you sooner, he said. You found me when you needed me, she said. When you were ready for what I actually was instead of what you'd been expecting. She picked up the hardware again. That's probably how it's supposed to work. He didn't have anything to add to that, and she didn't need him to, and they sat as the light finished going down and the first stars came up over the eastern ridge and the ranch settled into the night around them. Imperfect and rebuilt and genuinely, unsentimentally theirs. The ditch ran, the stable stood, the land record at the county office had their names on it together, in the same ink, filed properly and witnessed and beyond dispute. It was not a fairy story, and it had not been easy, and there were things about the year behind them that neither of them would ever describe as worth it. But the question of worth was simpler than it looked in the end. Worth was not about how things felt. Worth was about what held, and what you built with your hands, and whether you stayed when staying was the harder thing. Elena Voss had always known that. She had known it since she was 8 years old, and her mother had decided that the frontier was too hard. And she had looked at that decision and made a different one without anyone asking her to, and without knowing yet what it would cost. Silas Mercer had taken longer to learn it, which was the truth about him and not something he was proud of, but which was also just honest. Some people learned the essential things early, and some people learned them in the middle of a rainstorm on the side of a mountain when a stranger knelt in the mud beside their broken wheel and got to work. He had been fortunate enough to meet his education and wise enough, barely, to recognize it. That was enough. It was more than enough. On the frontier where nothing came easy and nothing stayed fixed without constant attention, and most things that were worth having required more from you than you thought you had, more than enough was, in its own quiet and unglamorous way, everything. There was an evening in August that Silas thought about later, not because anything particular happened during it, but because of the quality it had. The specific, unrepeatable quality of a moment that you recognize, while it's still occurring, as something you'll want to have held on to. He was on the porch. The day's work was done, and the light was going down behind the ridge in the west, and the valley was doing the thing it did on good evenings, going gold and then amber and then something without a clean name. And Elena was sitting on the step below him with a piece of iron hardware she'd been puzzling over for 2 days, turning it in her hands, not working on it, but thinking about it. They'd been quiet for a while, the comfortable kind. Do you ever think about the night on the mountain? Silas said. She turned the hardware over. Sometimes. What do you think about? She was quiet for a moment. I think about how I almost didn't stop. She didn't look at him. I was tired that night. I had a long day and the rain was bad, and I knew if I stopped to help someone I'd be another 2 hours getting home. She paused. I almost kept going. He hadn't known that. What made you stop? The wheel, she said. I could see from 20 yards that it was a spoke problem, and I knew I had the right wood in the cart. She turned the hardware over again. It would have bothered me, knowing I had what it needed and going past anyway. Silas looked out at the valley. I think about what I would have done if you hadn't stopped, he said. What would have happened to all of this? You would have figured something out. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been what it is. He paused. I spent 9 years saying no to people I should have said yes to, and yes to things I should have walked away from. I had a ranch, and I had land, and I had a reputation, and none of it... He stopped. None of it was enough by itself. I don't think I knew that until you. Elena set the hardware down on the step beside her. She looked out at the pastures where the cattle were settling into the evening. The irrigation channel caught the last light and held it for a moment, a thin line of silver running across the near pasture and on toward the north, doing its quiet work the way water always did. Not dramatically, not with any awareness of what it meant, just moving toward where it was needed. People kept telling me I wasn't what they expected, she said. What they expected from a woman. What they expected from a wife. A pause. I spent a lot of years being angry about that. You're not angry now? She considered it. Sometimes, she said, but it's less than it was. She was quiet a moment. I think I was angry because I thought it was something I needed to fix, what other people thought of me. I thought if I just worked hard enough or proved enough. She stopped. It doesn't fix. People think what they think. You can't work your way into someone else's respect. Harriet came around, he said. Harriet came around because she's a decent person who made a mistake and had enough character to say so. Elena looked at her hands. That's about Harriet, not about me. The things I did because they needed doing. Not for her and not for anyone else who was watching. She paused. That took me a while to understand. That you can do good work your whole life and it won't make everyone approve of you, and that's not the failure you think it is when you're young. Silas was quiet for a moment. The evening moved on around them, unhurried and indifferent to whatever they were working out on this porch. I should have found you sooner, he said. You found me when you needed me, she said. When you were ready for what I actually was, instead of what you'd been expecting. She picked up the hardware again. That's probably how it's supposed to work. He didn't have anything to add to that, and she didn't need him to. And they sat as the light finished going down and the first stars came up over the eastern ridge, and the ranch settled into the night around them. Imperfect and rebuilt and genuinely, unsentimentally theirs. The ditch ran. The stable stood. The land record at the county office had their names on it together, in the same ink, filed properly and witnessed and beyond dispute. It was not a fairy story, and it had not been easy, and there were things about the year behind them that neither of them would ever describe as worth it. But the question of worth was simpler than it looked in the end. Worth was not about how things felt. Worth was about what held, and what you built with your hands, and whether you stayed when staying was the harder thing. Elena Voss had always known that. She had known it since she was 8 years old, and her mother had decided that the frontier was too hard. And she had looked at that decision and made a different one without anyone asking her to and without knowing yet what it would cost. Silas Mercer had taken longer to learn it, which was the truth about him and not something he was proud of, but which was also just honest. Some people learned the essential things early, and some people learned them in the middle of a rainstorm on the side of a mountain when a stranger knelt in the mud beside their broken wheel and got to work. He had been fortunate enough to meet his education, and wise enough, barely, to recognize it. That was enough. It was more than enough. On the frontier where nothing came easy and nothing stayed fixed without constant attention, and most things that were worth having required more from you than you thought you had, more than enough was, in its own quiet and unglamorous way, everything.